morning. Thank you very much, Claire, for that really nice introduction. And good morning to everybody. I hope you've all had some coffee, and folks, especially you West Coasters, are feeling a little bit more awake. Maybe? Well, we'll get there. I'm going low-tech today. I'm just going to talk a little bit, and we're going to open up for some dialogue. No PowerPoints, no need to take notes. But I just want to start by telling you how happy I am to be here, and that I have gotten just the warmest welcome from this network of folks, and that is so important to me and tells me so much about all of you, about NACDD as an organization, how you function, how you care about one another. It's so interesting to just sort of make my way around and listen to some of your conversations, both last evening and again this morning, how you want to know how everybody's doing and how are your family, where are your children, where are your family members, what are you doing for the holidays, and this tells me that more than anything this is a family and a partnership, and I love that. We're going to talk more about that as time goes on. And so I just want to begin by telling you a little bit about myself, not just the boring things that are on a resume. I know you've all memorized my resume. But let me just tell you a little bit about who I am and what has brought me here to this point today. I am a believer that who you become really does start at home. It starts with how you're raised, things that you hear in your own home as you're growing up. I was born in Washington, D.C. I still live in Washington, D.C. in the area. Most people in D.C. think that that is just incredible and crazy because most of Washington is people who have come from other places and migrated to Washington. But I grew up there. My parents moved to the D.C. area around 1960 from New York. Because there was a plethora of government jobs at that time, and my father was looking for work, and the government was a great place to be. And so I grew up in a very small, really nice little suburb where there were a lot of government workers, and it was just a great place to grow up and be raised. My family was not particularly politically active, but extremely politically aware. I grew up in Prince George's County, probably only Brian in this room knows where that is. Just a little bit east of Washington, D.C., and the member of Congress who served that district when I was growing up and still is there today is Congressman Steny Hoyer. Some of you might be familiar with his name. He's in the leadership of the House of Representatives and is probably best known as the shepherd of the Americans with Disabilities Act, something near and dear to all of our hearts. So I've had a relationship because of where I grew up with the congressman since I was 16 years old and got to share a podium with him through a youth leadership event and have worked on all of his campaigns and worked with his staff for many years. So I kind of grew up in that atmosphere of, you know, when you live in Washington, you don't even always realize that you hear a lot of things locally because that's your local news, whereas to other people that's your national news. The Washington Post is your local newspaper, and it's got the world events, and it's got everything that's happening in Washington. It really wasn't until I was older and working, though, that I think that I really understood the depths of what I might have been hearing at home around the dinner table. I mentioned that my father worked for the government, and he worked for several different agency areas, but at some point, you know how as a kid you have no idea what your parents do? You know, unless they're like a teacher, my mom was a teacher, okay, I understood that, but you know, Dad worked for the government, I don't know what that is. And so what do you do? And he says, well, I do grants. I don't know, what's a grant? You know, well, we all in this room know that now, but as a kid I had really no idea. And so as I was growing up and getting into the work world myself, I realized that my father worked for this federal agency called ACF. Anybody heard of that? Yeah. So there came a day in 1990, the date I remember well, it was July 26th. Anybody know what July 26th was? It was the ADA. So July 26th, 1990 was the actual signing ceremony for the Americans with Disabilities Act. I had worked on the act, and I was actually one of the people who was in charge of putting together all of the events of that day. The big signing ceremony on the South Lawn, and then there was a big kind of festivities out on the ellipse, and it was wonderful. And so because I was working on that event, I was allowed to bring some guests, and so I asked my father to come on over. And so my dad came to the whole event with me, and he's feeling so proud, and we're walking along a path from the White House over to where the event was, and coming in the other direction is a woman by the name of Deborah McFadden. Anybody know Deborah McFadden? So for those of you who don't recognize the name, Deborah at the time was the ADD commissioner. So she comes up the other direction, and my dad and I are walking down the path, and she sees him, and she greets him, and, "Oh, Mr. Lewis, so nice to see you." And then she turns to me, "Oh, Donna, it's so nice to see you." And then she just stops for a second. She looks at him, she looks at me, she looks at him, she looks at me. She says, "I never put that together. Boy, the apple just doesn't fall far from the tree." And we chat a minute, and she walks on, and my dad and I looked at each other. Never really made that connection either, because up until that point, I was so busy working on legislative issues and working on the Hill and those things that we hadn't really connected that maybe what I was hearing about grants and the importance of ACF programs and ADD programs really was rubbing off on me. And so he was, of course, thrilled a few years later when I announced a job change and said that I was going to work for the university-affiliated programs, now known as the USET. So that's one aspect. I think sort of my growing up, this is what I always heard at the table and had a reverence and understood an importance for working in the disability community and providing programs and supports and services for all people. I think who your family is also dictates. I know many of us in this room, some of you are parents, some of you are siblings, some of you may be children of people with disabilities. Somehow you came into this role. I did not come into it with a personal connection. I came into it with a professional connection. I started work actually when I was still in college on Capitol Hill. I had actually gone to see if I could work for Congressman Hoyer. At the moment, he didn't have an opening for me, and so I went back to school and I looked through some lists, and I was studying journalism at the time, and I wanted to be press secretary on the Hill. So I went to become an assistant to a press secretary. Turned out that the congressman that I went to work for was Tony Coelho. Anybody know that name? So Tony, of course, the father of the ADA, a person who lives with epilepsy, very, very engaged to this day in disability policy. So I ended up working for Tony, and of course Steny, best friends, worked on a lot of issues together, so that sort of defined my career. But I am also a mother of 2 children, and my son, whose birthday is today, so I'll say happy birthday to him, 16 today. He does have 3 diagnoses, so I kind of came into that. He has ADD, learning disabilities, and type 1 diabetes. So I was also thrilled yesterday to walk into this hotel and find out that JDRF has their huge conference here. So I say that just to say that I've been on both sides of the table. I've sat in my share of IEP meetings from every which angle you can imagine, and been an advocate for my children and their needs in school as well. I remember one time a number of years ago when my son was, I think, in preschool, and there was an issue going on, and I started doing some emails and gathering some people together, and one of the other parents writes back to me and she says, "You know, you're pretty good at this. Maybe you should be a professional advocate." I said, "Did you look at the signature at the bottom of the email page?" Anyway, so yes, I have spent my time being a professional advocate. So just a couple words on my work history and where I come from. So because of working for Tony Coelho, who has epilepsy, I spent a lot of time working for the Epilepsy Foundation. That's where I began my career. I spent about 6 years with the Epilepsy Foundation, did a little bit of time with a group called the National Health Council, an umbrella organization for health and disability groups. Then I spent more than 10 years with AUCD, so many of you have already approached me on that angle with great connections. Wonderful crossover, of course, between the USEDs and the DD councils, and of course the PNAs. Then I went back to the Epilepsy Foundation, and that's where I've most recently come from, spending another 7 years with the Epilepsy Foundation. So throughout that time, I primarily worked on policy issues, grant issues, worked with CDC and HRSA and a number of other federal agencies, and of course always working with ADD, now AIDD. Welcome to Commissioner Sharon Lewis in the back of the room. So that's just a little bit of my background. In addition to my paid job, I've also taken on a lot of leadership roles within the community. Most recently, I have chaired the Consortium for Citizens with Disabilities. Some of you may be familiar with that. We have about 112 member organizations. The members are national organizations whose primary purpose is disability policy. And so I'm about to finish my tenure as chair January 9th. I get to give that up. I've loved it. It's wonderful. I will, of course, continue to be on the board as immediate past chair. I've been a member of the CCD group since 1987, and I've been on the board since its inception in 2000. It's been a great opportunity, and it's something that I would really like to continue in some capacity, because I think it brings a lot to this organization. It brings some visibility, it brings some connections, and it certainly yields us a lot of information about policy issues that are near and dear to all of our hearts and help us to do our work better. Some of you, well, I believe most of you know, how small our staff in the Washington office actually is. And I do want to, I know everybody knows Cheryl and Hillary. If you haven't met them yet, please do. They are two of our 5 staff who work at our national office. They're all fantastic. They're an incredible team. I'm very blessed to have them. But I think most of you know Peggy Hathaway. Peggy is our policy director. She works very closely with Deborah, who chairs the Public Policy Committee. It's hard as one person to really do an incredible amount of work. That we have so many needs and so many pieces of legislation that need to be weighed in on. And so it's good to have a coalition behind us that can help us do that, and in essence almost act like additional staff in our office. So it's important that we share in that role. In addition, I take leadership in another group called the Coalition for Health Funding. That is a group that has been around for 30-something years, I think. Its primary purpose is to advocate on behalf of appropriations, federal funding, for health and disability programs, and to make sure that there is an understanding amongst policymakers about what is public health, why do we need to fund public health, why do health and disability programs need support, and what happens if they go away. As you can imagine, with 35 days looming until the fiscal cliff comes, and we might drop over it, this group has been very instrumental in making sure that we're sharing our messages and talking about why funding is so very important. So that's just a little bit of background about me. I've been talking individually with some of you, happy to share any other information, and I'm so very much looking forward to getting to know each of you personally as well, because I think that helps in how we do our work when we know each other better and kind of get a sense of where we come from and where we're going. So